Aileen Wuornos became a name that struck fear across America in the late 20th century. Her criminal career spanned just 1 year, from 1989 to 1990, but in that short time, she carried out a series of chilling murders on the roads of Florida. Her method was simple yet highly deceptive. She'd stand by the road acting like she needed a ride and lure in some unsuspecting guy with a car. Sitting in the car, she'd chat with them, making them feel relaxed. When they got to a secluded spot, she'd pull out a gun and shoot them coldly. Then she'd ditch them on the side of the road or in the woods and drive off in their cars. Most of her victims were regular, middle-class guys who probably never thought that the seemingly helpless woman they picked up would turn out to be a killer. During her trial, she claimed she acted in self-defense, saying those men had tried to rape and harm her. Just before her execution, in what seemed like a moment of madness, she left behind a cryptic statement. "I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Aileen was born in Rochester, Michigan, on February 29, 1956, into a life of hardship. Just 2 months before she was born, her mom divorced her dad. After the divorce, Aileen and her brother were left to live with their mother in a tiny, run-down room, and their mom was just 16, had no steady job, and could not really take of them. In January 1960, as Aileen approached her 4th birthday, instead of receiving a gift, she was suddenly abandoned by her mother without warning. The 2 children were handed over to their maternal grandparents, a Finnish-American couple who legally adopted them, but this new home was far from a safe haven. Her grandparents were heavy drinkers, and their days were consumed by alcohol and arguments, and they often resorted to violence against the children. Aileen's childhood was marked by abuse and sexual assault. Her grandfather frequently subjected her to physical and sexual abuse, even forcing her to undress before beating her. But in 1992, her uncle claimed that her grandfather had never abused her. Some experts think that Aileen's criminal behavior was linked to her psychopathic personality and psychological trauma. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, both of which are largely rooted in the sexual abuse she endured as a child and her later involvement in sex work. When Aileen was 11, she started doing sexual things with boys at school in exchange for cigarettes. Even more shockingly, her own brother was involved, having sexual contact with her. That same year, her father was sentenced to life in prison for kidnapping and sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl. Although she had never met him, her father's crimes only added to the chaos and brokenness of her childhood. In 1970, at the age of 14, Aileen became pregnant after a long period of sexual abuse by family and friends. Just a year earlier, her father had killed himself in prison because he was mentally unstable. On March 23, 1971, she gave birth to a boy at a welfare facility. The father's identity was unknown, and the child was eventually put up for adoption. For this kid, leaving this shattered family was likely the best outcome. A few months later, Aileen's grandmother passed away from liver failure caused by years of heavy drinking. And her grandfather kicked her out of the house, forcing her to drop out of school and begin a life of homelessness. She ended up wandering the woods near her hometown, surviving by continuing to engage in sex work. This cycle of homelessness and desperation pushed her further into a life of crime. On May 27, 1974, at the age of 18, Aileen was arrested in Jefferson County, Colorado, on charges including drunk driving, disorderly conduct, and firing a gun from a moving vehicle. Later, she faced additional charges for failing to appear in court. By this time, her temper had grown increasingly volatile. 2 years later, Aileen hitchhiked to Florida, where she met 69-year-old Louis Gratz-Fell, the president of a yacht club. They quickly married, and their wedding even made the local newspaper. She was after his money, while he was drawn to her youthful energy. However, their happiness was short-lived. Just a few weeks later, Aileen was arrested for assaulting someone in a bar and beating Fell with a cane. Fell obtained a restraining order against her. After returning to Michigan, Aileen was arrested again on July 14, 1976, at the Bunny Club in Mansalona, for throwing a cue ball at a bartender's head and causing a disturbance. On July 17th, her biological brother died of esophageal cancer. As the beneficiary of his life insurance, she received $10,000. 4 days later, Fell filed for divorce, citing the restraining order. For Aileen, $10,000 was a significant sum of money, but as the saying goes, people often lose wealth that exceeds their ability to manage it, and Aileen was no exception. Within 2 months, She had squandered the entire amount on luxury items and a new car, which she later destroyed. In 1978, at the age of 22, Aileen shot herself in the abdomen in an attempt to end her life, but once again, she survived. In fact, between the ages of 14 and 22, she had attempted suicide 6 times, each time without success. On May 20th, 1981, Aileen was arrested in Edgewater, Florida, for armed robbery of a convenience store. She stole $35 and 2 packs of cigarettes. Then she was sentenced to prison on May 4th, 1982, and was released on June 30th, 1983. A year after her release, Aileen was arrested again for attempting to pass a forged check at a bank in Key West. On November 30th, 1985, she was named a suspect in a revolver and ammunition theft case in Pasco County. By this point, her criminal activities were escalating, ranging from sex work and assault to armed robbery, fraud, and gun theft. On January 4th, 1986, Aileen was arrested in Miami for car theft, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice. Police also found a .38 caliber revolver and a box of ammunition in the stolen car. On June 2nd, a Volusia County deputy sheriff detained her for questioning after a male companion accused her of pulling a gun on him in his car and demanding $200. Police later discovered a .22 pistol under the passenger seat where she had been sitting. In 1986, 30-year-old Aileen met 24-year-old Tyria Moore, a motel maid, at a gay bar called Zodiac in Daytona Beach. Aileen fell deeply in love with her, and the two quickly moved in together. She continued to engage in sex work to support them both. On July 4th, 1987, Daytona Beach police detained Aileen and Moore at a bar for allegedly assaulting someone with a beer bottle. On March 12, 1988, Aileen accused a Daytona Beach bus driver of assaulting her, claiming he had pushed her off the bus after a confrontation. Moore was a witness to the incident. In this era, American society was mostly negative towards homosexuality, especially lesbians, who were often labeled as morally corrupt or mentally unbalanced. For Aileen and Moore, this was an insurmountable societal barrier. During her trial, Aileen once said, "This is a love beyond words. No earthly language can describe what I feel for Moore." Even up to her execution, she maintained that she loved Moore. In just 1 year, Aileen murdered 7 men, all of whom were drivers between the ages of 40 and 65. During her trial, she said, "I did what I did, but I'm the one being executed. They violently raped me, and I had to beg for my life." However, only the families of the victims truly knew what kind of men their fathers or husbands had been. Richard Charles Mallory, 51-year-old, was the owner of an electronics store in Clearwater, Florida, and Aileen's first victim. On November 30th, 1989, Mallory encountered Aileen and tragically lost his life. She claimed that he drove her to a remote area where he beat, raped, and sexually assaulted her. Aileen insisted that she killed him in self-defense. It's worth noting that Mallory had previously been convicted of attempted rape in Maryland. 2 days after the murder, a deputy sheriff in Volusia County discovered Mallory's car. On December 13th, his body was found in a wooded area several miles away. The autopsy revealed that he had been shot multiple times, with 2 bullets striking his left lung, which was the direct cause of his death. David Andrew Spears, 47-year-old, was a construction worker from Winter Garden, Florida. On May 19, 1990, he was reported missing. 2 weeks later, his body was discovered along a highway in Citrus County, a scene that was both shocking and grim. The autopsy revealed that Spears had been shot 6 times, all from a .22 caliber handgun, which directly caused his death. Charles Edmund Carskadden, 40-year-old, worked part-time as a rodeo cowboy. He went missing on May 31, 1990, after meeting Aileen. A few days later, his body was found in Pasco County, Florida. The autopsy showed he'd been shot 9 times, all from a .22 caliber gun. What was really disturbing was that his body was wrapped in an electric blanket and was already badly decomposed. Witnesses also said they saw Aileen driving his car, and she'd sold a gun confirmed to be his to a local pawn shop. Peter Abraham Seams, 65-year-old, was a retired sailor. In June 1990, he left Jupiter, Florida, planning to drive to Arkansas, but he never arrived. On July 4, 1990, his car was found in Orange Springs, Florida. Despite a huge search, his body was never found. Troy Eugene Burris, 50-year-old, was a sausage salesman from Ocala, Florida. He disappeared on July 31, 1990. A few days later, his body was found in the woods along State Road 19 in Marion County, Florida. The autopsy showed he'd been shot twice, and that's what killed him. Charles Richard Humphreys, 56-year-old, was a retired Air Force major who'd also worked as a child abuse investigator and police chief. He went missing on September 11, 1990, after meeting Aileen. His body was found the next day in Marion County, Florida. The autopsy showed he'd been shot 7 times in the head and chest. His car was later found in Suwannee County. Walter Gino Antonio, 61-year-old, was a truck driver, security guard, and part-time cop. On November 19, 1990, his body was found near a logging road in Dixie County, Florida. He was almost naked, and the autopsy showed he'd been shot 4 times. 5 days later, his car was found in Brevard County. His murder was the last in Aileen's string of killings. On July 4, 1990, Aileen and Moore were involved in a car accident while driving Siems's vehicle. Although they abandoned the car at the scene, a woman witnessed the incident. Unsure of what had happened but aware of the news reports about Siems's murder and his missing car, she reported what she saw to the police. Later, investigators discovered some of the victim's belongings at a pawn shop. The receipt found there had fingerprints that matched those left in Siems's car. Coincidentally, Aileen had a prior criminal record in Florida, and her fingerprints were already in the police database. Since Siems was the 4th victim in this series of murders, the police concluded that Aileen, who had been driving his car, couldn't possibly be uninvolved in the case. On January 9, 1991, Aileen was arrested at the Last Resort Biker Bar in Volusia County. At the time, the police had issued a warrant under the name Lori Grody, one of the aliases Aileen used to hide her true identity. She frequently used different fake names to avoid being tracked by law enforcement. So when she was arrested under this name, she was completely caught off guard, thinking it was only for a minor charge. The next day, the police located Moore in Pennsylvania. They pressured her, warning that she could receive immunity from prosecution if she cooperated with the investigation and provided testimony. She then returned to Florida with the police. Before the trial began, she was placed in a motel. Because Aileen was deeply in love with her, when Moore followed the police's instructions and pleaded with Aileen to help clear her name, Aileen confessed to the murders just 3 days later. In November, something completely unexpected happened. A 44-year-old woman named Arlene Prail legally adopted Aileen through formal proceedings. She was a horse farm owner and a devout Christian. In January 1991, she had seen Aileen's photo in the newspaper and felt a powerful sense of purpose. She believed it was God's calling and decided to help this woman who had been cast aside by society. Prail stated that she wanted to give Aileen a sense of family warmth and show her that someone truly cared. She firmly believed Aileen was misunderstood. On January 14, 1992, Aileen went on trial for the murder of Mallory. Typically, past criminal records aren't admissible in criminal trials. But under Florida's Williams rule, the prosecution was allowed to introduce evidence related to her other crimes to demonstrate a pattern of unlawful behavior. 2 weeks later, with Moore's testimony aiding the case, Aileen was convicted of Mallory's murder. During sentencing, defense psychiatrists testified that she was mentally unstable, diagnosing her with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. 4 days later, she was sentenced to death in the Mallory case. In fact, Aileen's defense team had worked tirelessly during the trial to present evidence showing that Mallory had previously been convicted of attempted rape in Maryland and had served time in a maximum security correctional facility for sex offenders. They argued that Mallory, the victim, had strong antisocial tendencies and tried hard to exonerate Aileen. However, the judge rejected these arguments as evidence and denied their request for a retrial. Aileen told the judge, "I want to admit to you that Mallory did violently rape me, as I said, but the others did not, they just wanted to." Over the next year, Aileen was sentenced to death 5 times for the murders of Humphreys, Burris, Spears, Charles, and Antonio. Since Siems's body was never found, Aileen was ultimately sentenced to death 6 times in total. She was then held in the Women's Death Row Unit at Broward Correctional Institution under the Florida Department of Corrections before being transferred to Florida State Prison to await execution. In 1996, Aileen's appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied. 5 years later, in a petition to the Florida Supreme Court, she stated her intention to fire her legal counsel and terminate all pending appeals. She wrote, "I killed those men, robbed them, and was as cold as ice. I'd do it again. There's no chance of keeping me alive or anything because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. I'm one of those people who hates human life. I'd kill again." She also said, "I'm so sick of hearing she's crazy. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm sane, I'm rational, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm a person who hates human life intensely, and I'd kill again. She claimed that all 7 men had either raped or attempted to rape her while she was working as a prostitute, but she later withdrew her self-defense claims, stating she killed them to rob them and avoid leaving witnesses. She explained that she withdrew the self-defense argument because she had already spent 10 years in prison and couldn't bear it any longer. She wanted to die. Although her lawyers argued that she wasn't mentally competent to make such a request, Aileen insisted she knew what she was doing, and a court-appointed panel of psychiatrists supported her claim. On October 9, 2002, Aileen was executed by lethal injection. She declined a last meal, opting only for a cup of coffee. Her final words were, "I would just like to say I'm sailing with the rock and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." At 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time, Aileen was pronounced dead. She was the second woman executed in Florida and the 10th in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. After her death, Aileen's body was cremated, and her ashes were scattered under a tree in her hometown in Michigan by a childhood friend.